think of the situation the disciples faced following Jesus' crucifixion. Number one, their leader was dead. And Jewish messianic expectations included no idea of a Messiah who, instead of triumphing over Israel's enemies, would be humiliatingly executed by them as a criminal. Two, Jewish beliefs about the afterlife precluded anyone's rising from the dead to glory and immortality before the resurrection at the end of the world. Nevertheless, the original disciples suddenly and sincerely came to believe so strongly that God had raised Jesus from the dead that they were willing to go to torturous deaths for the truth of that belief. The eminent British scholar N.T. Wright observes, if nothing happened after Jesus' death, then any first century Jew would have said he was another deluded fanatic. That is why, as a historian, I cannot explain the rise of early Christianity unless Jesus rose again, leaving an empty tomb behind him, end quote. As a world-famous Islamicist, Kenneth Cragg, notes, this means that, quote, Muslim writers face a deep historical problem, since they are obliged to explain the impact of Jesus in terms of his teachings only. The place where the resurrection stands is, for Islam, a blank, yet its sequel cannot be ignored, even if, on the Muslim view, it has to be a sequel without a properly total source, end quote. Now, all of this has enormous theological significance. By raising him from the dead, God has dramatically and publicly vindicated those allegedly blasphemous claims for which Jesus was crucified. As the German theologian Wolfhard Pannenberg explains, the resurrection of Jesus acquires such decisive meaning, not merely because someone or anyone has been raised from the dead, but because it is Jesus of Nazareth, whose execution was instigated because he had blasphemed against God. If this man was raised from the dead, that plainly means that the God whom he had allegedly blasphemed has committed himself to him. But that means that Jesus must have been exactly who he claimed to be, the unique Son of God and the divine human Son of Man. And that's why Christians believe that Jesus was not merely human, but also divine. In summary, then, on purely historical grounds, we've seen, number one, that Jesus of Nazareth possessed a radical self-concept as the Son of God and as the divine human Son of Man. Two, that he was tried, condemned, and executed for his allegedly blasphemous claims. And three, that God raised him from the dead in vindication of those claims. All of this stands in contrast to the Quran's claims that Jesus thought of himself as a mere prophet, preaching a blasé monotheism, that he was not crucified, and that he did not, in fact, rise from the dead. When you think about it, however, this situation isn't really surprising. I mean, which would you trust? Documents which were written down within the first generation after the events they record, while the eyewitnesses were still alive, or a book written over 600 years after the events by a person who had no independent historical source of information? Why, even to ask the question is to answer it. In fact, the Quran contains demonstrably legendary stories about Jesus which evolved during the centuries after his death. I'm referring to stories about Jesus which are found in the so-called apocryphal Gospels. These are forgeries which appeared in the 2nd and 3rd centuries after Christ, and which the Quran picks up and allegedly repeats as facts. For example, the Quran mentions the story borrowed from the legendary forgery called the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, of how the boy Jesus made a bird out of clay and made it come to life. Such stories are legendary fictions. And thus the Quran offers us no independent historical source of information about Jesus. And that is why no historical scholar turns to the Quran as a source of information about the historical Jesus. So, who is the real historical Jesus? The Jesus of the New Testament, who claimed to be the unique Son of God and the divine human Son of Man, who was tried, condemned, and crucified for those radical claims, who rose from the dead in confirmation of those claims? Or is it the Jesus of the Quran, an anachronistic preacher of a blasé monotheism, who thought of himself as no more than a human prophet, who did not die on the cross and who never rose from the dead? Praise be to God that it is the Jesus of the New Testament which withstands the test of historical investigation.
A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. I begin in the name of God, most gracious, most merciful. Mr. Chairman, MC John Smythe, my erstwhile competitor, Dr. William Lane Craig, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. It's an immense privilege to be sharing this platform with so eminent an individual as Dr. Craig tonight, and it's my privilege to be back in Cape Town. I must say that in half an hour, Dr. Craig has confirmed what I had initially predicted, and that is he has not adduced a single passage or verse from the New Testament where Jesus proclaims divinity, where he says, I am God, or where he says, worship me. In fact, what he seems to be having engaged in is a process of what we would call decontextualization, and so I'm pretty surprised by the weakness of the arguments that I hear this evening. Coming to the topic, identifying Jesus, is he man or both man and God? I think the theme for the program or this evening is a claim or a cry by this particular individual called Job. And he says in Job chapter 25 verse 4, how then can man be justified with God? Or how can he be clean that he's born of a woman? Behold, even to the moon, and it shineth not. Ye the stars are not pure in his sight. How much less man that is a maggot, and the Son of Man who is a worm? Man is described as a maggot according to the book of Job. The Son of Man, if we have to apply the same particular, you're assuming you want to apply 1001 prophecies to Jesus, the Son of Man is described as a worm, a slightly higher degree. Now that's a theme for this particular evening, and it's important that some of the statements I make are not meant to offend any particular individual tonight. At the outset, we need to basically come to this particular point, that it's important in a debate of this nature that we look at our source. Without detracting from the debate, if the source is in doubt, then reliance upon that particular source to prove a theological point doesn't prove anything. Many people are unaware of the fact that what we have as the New Testament is nothing more than an eclectic edition. And I'm surprised that Dr. Craig, as a noted scholar, never pointed that out. What the textual critic does is that he selects, he rewrites, or he chooses from a collection of manuscripts to determine what might be the original. Sometimes the selection amounts to no more than an informed guess. Here we have a collection of manuscripts, different types of manuscripts like the papyri, uncials, curses, minuscules. Out of a total of 5,847 manuscripts, you can see that the existing editions of the Greek New Testament use a particular minority, sometimes going down as low as 5%. Why? This is a committee of Bible societies such as Bruce Metzger sitting in the middle with a number of individuals, and what are they doing? They're developing the New Testament based on the existing manuscripts. Of the 5,847 Greek manuscripts, no two, apart from the very tiniest fragments, are identical. In fact, up until the 8th century, there is not one Greek manuscript that contains the entire New Testament in its particular order. until, of course, the dated Uspensky Gospels of the 8th century. One can go on further. What about the words of Jesus? Are we in possession of the words of Jesus today? What people and scholars tell us is that Jesus spoke Aramaic, not Greek. Further on, as you can see in Acts 26:14, Jesus spoke to Paul in the Hebrew dialect. Some translators have it as Aramaic. So the problem is that if the source is not reliable, if we're not sure we don't have the original words of Jesus, then how can we go about making these particular claims that he allegedly made? An interesting point to also note is that when we look at the relationships between the synoptic gospels, Dr. Craig subscribes to a theory called Markan priority, which I accept, which many fundamentalist Christians will not accept, which is that Mark was the first gospel to be written, and then Matthew, Luke, and John subsequently followed, based upon the works of Mark. As you can see, there's a triple tradition and there's a double tradition. There are passages in Matthew which are taken directly from Mark, passages in Luke and Matthew which are identical, passages which are only unique to Mark. And in accordance with that, Mark is seen to be the primary source. The four Gospels in the Christian Bible, if we are to concede that they are the primary available materials for Jesus, then it's important to note that when we compare one Gospel to another, we can see how stories, for example, about Jesus were changed to reflect a higher view of Jesus. For example, scholars today, the vast majority would state that the Gospels themselves were written not as historical works, but as apologetic works to prove particular theological motifs. If you, for example, compare Mark to Matthew, we can see how the later gospel changed individual reports to raise the view of Jesus in the following ways. For example, passages where people call Jesus Lord. In one occasion when Jesus was transfigured, in Mark, Peter calls him Rabbi, but in Matthew, Peter calls him Lord. To have Jesus refer to himself as Lord. When Jesus directed his disciples to wait and watch for his imminent return, in Mark he called himself the master of the house, but in Matthew he calls himself your Lord. Same passage, improvement. Jesus being called the Son of God. At Caesarea Philippi, Jesus asks Peter who he thought he was. In Mark, Peter says, you are the Messiah. But in Matthew, Peter says, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. So you see, Matthew has added the title, the Son of the living God. To have people pray to Jesus. When Jesus was asleep in a boat and the storm rocked the boat, in Mark the disciples awake, and what do they say? They say, Teacher, do you not care if we drown? But in Matthew, they pray to Jesus and say, Lord, save us, we are perishing. So the rebuke from Mark on the same incident was changed to a particular prayer. So comparing Mark to Matthew in this particular way, we have seen how Matthew has reworked the material to bring out later Christian teachings. And in fact, the difference is far more pronounced when you go to John's Gospel. In John's Gospel, you'd find Jesus makes the most significant and far-reaching claims. I am the light of the world. I am the resurrection. I am the way, the truth, and the life. Now, if Jesus said these things, then why is it that the other Gospels would surely have recorded them? They are not there. But they did not, because he did not say such things. The manner in which Jesus approaches death has also been reworked. In Mark, Jesus begs God to save him from the cross, though he submits to God's decision. But in John, Jesus declares that he will not be prey to be saved, in John 12:27. So we can see that in this way, when we multiply the examples of how one after another the Gospels went about modifying the image of Jesus for later readers. And when we compare Mark with the later Gospels, you notice the modifications in the later ones. If we could compare Mark with its predecessors, then you would find that Mark has also modified his story. And so this is the actual relationship between the Synoptic Gospels, which I would submit that Dr. Craig would not take any objection to in principle, because he would subscribe to the same view with his scholarship. One last point. The death of Jesus after the Passover, during the Passover. In Mark 14:12, the disciples asked Jesus where they are to prepare the Passover meal for that evening. In other words, that's on the day of the preparation for the Passover. But in John's Gospel, we are told that Pilate pronounces that sentence on that particular day of the preparation for the Passover. Now, Dr. Craig would obviously have to explain that to us. Why? You know why? Because in John's Gospel, Jesus is that sacrificial lamb. He is that Passover lamb whose sacrifice brings salvation from sins. So in other words, John has changed the historical datum to make a particular theological point. Jesus is that sacrifice. And to convey that theological point, John has to now create a discrepancy between his account and the other particular Gospels. So it's important that you need to look at this in context. Do not decontextualize Scripture. If you do that, you will do violence to the particular text. The article of faith in the first century, according to the Apostolic Creed, as articulated by Theodore Zahn, was, I believe in God the Almighty. That was always the case. Between 180 and 210, the word Father was added before the Almighty, meaning I believe in God the Father Almighty, which was obviously bitterly disputed by later churches. Then we have this council. It was church councils that had to declare the divinity of Christ. Incarnation was defined as a doctrine only long after the struggles by the particular church council. It's interesting to note that in an email discussion with Udo Carsten, Dr. Craig refused to discuss the topic, is Jesus God? And he said, well, you have to go back to the actual belief as is found in the Council of Chalcedon, which defined the two natures of Christ, both human and divine. The vast majority of Christian scholars in the world today actually reject the idea, not because it is difficult to understand, but because it cannot be meaningfully expressed. We have a problem here. If we are to believe that Jesus is both human and divine, which Dr. Craig hasn't spent much time elaborating on, then it stands to reason that everything Jesus has done is done both by the humanity and the divinity in him. So likewise, everything that happened to him happened to both the man and God that he is. Mary gave birth to both died on the cross, etc. Huston Smith is a world-renowned writer on comparative religion. In his book, The World's Religions, he said that the Orthodox doctrine is logically incompatible. Why? He says, we may begin with the doctrine of incarnation, which took several centuries to fix. Holding as it does that in Christ God assumed a human body, it affirms that Christ was God-man, simultaneously, both fully man and fully God. To say such a contention is paradoxical seems a charitable way to put it. Why? He says it seems more like a blatant contradiction. If the doctrine held that Christ was half human and half divine, or that he was divine in other respects, our minds would not balk. It's interesting to note that in the internet, on the actual TV show by Lee Strobel, Faith on Fire, Dr. Craig conceded in the debate with Rabbi Tovia Singer that the Trinity cannot be found in the Old Testament. You can't derive it, it's not there. The existence of the Trinity would be hard to find, hard-pressed to find, to paraphrase what he actually said. I would submit that the same principle would apply in the New Testament. It's not there. For there are three that bear record in heaven, the Father, the Word, and the Holy Spirit, and these three are one. Whereabout is it in the Bible? Maybe Dr. Craig could inform us. C. Randolph Ross, who's a particular writer, in his book Common Sense Christianity, he debunks the Orthodox view, not because it can be difficult to understand, but because it cannot be meaningfully said. He says to be human is to be finite, limited in knowledge, fallible, imperfect. To be human also means to be aware of one's finitude. If Jesus was human, then he was all of these, and indeed this is how the Gospels portray him, experiencing anger, fatigue, uncertainty, reluctance, pain, and even death. To be God means to be eternal and unlimited. Now either Jesus of Nazareth was limited, fallible, or he was unlimited, infallible, and perfect. These two sets of attributes are so opposite of each other, you can't have it both ways. In other words, you can't have your cake and eat it at the same time. He was either one or the other. You can't say of one person that he was both. Now we've got a challenge before us, and perhaps I'm hoping that Dr. Craig could give us in the rebuttal. Unpack before us one model that would demonstrate the two natures of Christ in Christian theology. Show me one model. Some people have tried it, using a circle and the aspect or illustration of a square. Let's look at a square or a circle representing divinity. That would fail because Jesus is said to be both human and divine. What about a square representing his humanity? That would fail because Jesus is said to be both human and divine. What about an object somewhat round and somewhat square. That would fail because Christ is said to be completely human and completely divine. What about a circle inside a square? That would fail because they say that God became man, not that God was inside the man. What about a square inside a circle? That would fail because man is not said to be inside God. So we're coming back to the question. Dr. Craig would have to, in his rebuttal, show us a particular model. He's written an article called The Birth of God. And it's quite interesting in that article, he suggests in order to prove the divinity of Christ, that Christ's divinity was part of his subliminal subconscious. In other words, and he gives the analogy akin to a person suffering from multiple personality disorder. So, are you saying that Jesus was God or divine, but he was not aware of his divinity? It was part of his subconscious, subliminal? Explain and unpack the model before us. That's what needs to be done in the reply. Some would say, Randolph Ross continues, that's a paradox. But he responds by saying it's not a paradox. A paradox is something which seems impossible, but can be demonstrated to be true. For example, it was a paradox when the scientists analyzed bumblebees and they concluded that according to the laws of physics they couldn't fly. But the bumblebees continued flying. There was an apparent contradiction and an apparent impossibility, but bumblebees kept on flying. But for an individual to be perfect and imperfect is the reverse of this. It may seem true to some, but is not demonstrably impossible. And not just impossible according to our understandings of the laws of nature, but impossible according to the rules of logic upon which all reasoning is based. Unless we can concede honestly, Dr. Craig can say, look, this is not according to logic, this is according to belief. Be honest and suggest that. Like, for example, what we have here. If you were to, for example, the Orthodox would basically say that Jesus was perfect with regards to his human nature, imperfect with regards to his human nature, but perfect with regards to his divine nature. The problem with that is that it implies the existence of two persons occupying one body of Jesus. One perfect, the other imperfect. Two minds, two wills, two characters. But the creed doesn't allow it. It says that somehow or the other, Jesus was not two persons, but only one. Let me elaborate the last point. That new knowledge can often declare old knowledge to be false. But with the rules of logic, things are different. What is true by definition will always remain true, unless, of course, you start redefining things. For example, 2 plus 2 is equal to 4. That equation will always remain true, unless, of course, you start deciding to change the definition of the component parts. Now, by definition, a thing cannot be the opposite of itself. A thing cannot be perfect and imperfect at the same time. The presence of one of these qualities implies the absence of the other. Jesus was either one or the other, but he cannot logically be both. I've got a question for Dr. Craig. I mean, can you get a fat, thin man before that? To say someone is both perfect and imperfect is like saying you saw a square circle or a fat, thin man. This is an impossibility. Are you saying the circle was not round, in which case it was not a circle, or are you saying the square was circular? This is not a paradox, this is meaningless nonsense, however imaginative it may be. That's what C. Randolph Ross